And we do archaeology. We're active archaeologists. We do archaeology every summer. We're slated to go back up into Mongolia this summer. And that stuff is pretty interesting. But there's a lot of really interesting things that happen in Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming. They're contiguous states if you look at it in one way or another. But there's some pretty intriguing things. And so we had an article published by the International Archaeology Journal this fall by the Society of Historical Archaeology, and it was on stage stations. The unfortunate thing about that is very few people even knew we were excavating it. So I thought that it would be a good thing to share what we've learned and go through and talk about the archaeology at stage stations and look at it from a standpoint of self-sustained entities along a particularly long trail. Next slide, please.
I was going to see it.
Okay.
Nope. Nope.
So we'll do this manually.
Very manually.
The Butterfield and Overland Stage line shared many features. One, there's a lack of wood. And if you've been in Southern Arizona, you can agree with me on this one, right? And same thing in the Mojave. One, lack of wood. Two, lack of water. And three, they had to cross over rough terrain. There are some places that are really flat, like in Southern Arizona, it's really flat where the Butterfield crossed. It's really flat in some places in southwestern Wyoming. And then it goes from flat to crazy. So you have to go through canyons, you have to go over ravines and everything else like this. But what I'd like to focus on a little bit is on wood and water. If I had enough time, I was going to look at how they mined coal in certain places, what they did to make sure that there's adequate heat in the places. But what I'll look at more this time is a little bit about water. Next slide, please. Stage stations often served as the first permanent structures in what would become new settlements. So the stage station was what would become new settlements. The stage station was the first there. Now, there's some interesting things about this. In some ways, it's an experiment. You put these stone buildings, and most of them here in Arizona, in Southern Arizona, in the Butterfield or adobe or stone, you put these stone buildings there and you have to sustain life day in and day out. And you can actually see if that community will last or what the possibilities are within that particular area. So you build a lot of the structures out of stones, but these places were the beginning of settlements in some areas. In Wyoming, it would be Rock Springs, it would be Evanston, it would be all kinds of different little communities like that. The first thing that they ever had was a stage station built there. They were also some of the first miners. Because of that lack of wood, there was ample amount of coal in some of these places. They mined coal and they began to tell people about how much coal it was there. That becomes critical for the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad because they know the quality of the coal, how hot the coal was going to be, how good it was, how deep the drifts and seams were, so they could actually use it for burning inside of the railroads. Next slide, please. Both along the Butterfield and Overland stage lines, communities evolved around good water sources, and stage stations were among the first to utilize the water. So that's natural. The quality of the water is another issue that we have in Arizona and in Wyoming. It's too alkaline. Alkalinity will cause a lot of problems. On the Overland Stage, on the Oregon Trail from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, there's a grave every 200 feet. From St. Joseph to South Pass inside of Wyoming, most people died of cholera, smallpox, or something they caught in the settlements towards the Mississippi or Missouri River. From South Pass to Sacramento, they died of alkali poisoning because the water had so much alkali and it would cause all kinds of problems, and they died of chemical poisoning, is basically speaking. That statistic is pretty well validated through many publications. Unruh is the best. He wrote a book about the Overland Trails, and he did real good research about the number of deaths. It's just amazing amount of work. He went through all the trail diaries. He documented it. So the quality of the water was important. And if they found out that they could sustain themselves with a stage station here on whatever water it was, make adjustments, maybe sometimes it could treat the water. They learned what was a good place to stay, what was not a good place to stay by the needs of the amount of cattle that they were going to have in that particular area. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the Butterfield line. And I'm not going to go into the Butterfield line too much, but as a point of comparison. And the Butterfield line is the longest stagecoach line in the world. Now, you can always read that in the Chamber of Commerce place where they talk about our state has the biggest, best, it pronounces the words most properly of any place in the world. But the Butterfield is the longest stage line that we know of. I think there's one in Siberia that was longer, but the ones in Siberia are kind of like the ones in Canada. They had a waterway that they used by canoes and that they traveled, and then they got off on the stages. So possibly this is the longest one in the world, but it was massive. When they constructed this, they did the same thing that they do on the Overland, and I'll repeat this in a moment. They had home stations and they had swing stations. Home stations where they had a blacksmith shop, and then they had repairs and they would feed food. Then 17 or 20 miles, depending on where you were on the Butterfield or on the Overland, you'd have a swing station, and that's where you'd change horses because horses wear out. So they'd make the 11 to 17 mile trip, then they change horses and they go on their way. And I'll come back to this in a little bit later. But the home station had the blacksmith shop. Now, here's a problem: is farriers, which is a fancy word for horseshoers. Horseshoeing was needed all the time. So each place had to have some skills or had to have some kind of blacksmith shop there. And basically everybody was trained on how to be a blacksmith. You learned how to be a carpenter. You learned how to build your own things, because you can't run to Home Depot and get new tools, new parts, or anything. You have to be able to be self-sufficient. Next slide, please. The remains of the Butterfield Station, Apache Springs in the Apache Pass, is shown here in this slide. I'll give you a better one in just a second. So this remains. Next slide. And what this shows is use of local material. The archaeologists at the University of Arizona have come up with one rule in archaeology that stands the test of time. You carry the heaviest thing the least farthest. So if there's rocks, you just carry the rocks a little distance and you build your house, you set your foundations, but you carry the heaviest thing the least distance. The heaviest thing over time is not the rocks, but water. And so we have this debate about it. We had to reconstruct a granary and we had to carry in water. And what we carried in weighed 35 pounds. And it was supposed to be 5 gallons. Well, they cheated us. It's not 5 gallons because I was told at the last time, not for this lecture, I've never given this lecture before, that a gallon of water weighs 8 pounds. But over time, when you're carrying 8 pounds and you have to go get water and retrieve it back, that's a lot of weight, especially if you have to get it for the animals. So according to fable, they negotiated with the coaches to put the Butterfield Stage Station by the spring as long as it was a distance from the spring, so that there was no impediment to the Apache coming and getting water at the spring. But this is what you look for. You set your home stations near the best water. So on Apache Pass, they would have had a home station at this particular Butterfield Station. If you read something that says that it was a swing, possibly what it did was oscillate back and forth, because once you had good water, once you had good resources, the home station became set. And I'll go into this a little bit more. Next slide, please. This just is the setting in Apache Pass. And there's a saying about Wyoming that applies to Arizona. You're either freezing, roasting, or blasting to death, meaning it's really hot, it's really cold, or it's really windy. So these kind of things are just endemic to where they had to take these stagecoaches across. Next slide, please. It's good insect repellent. You don't have any mosquitoes when the wind's blowing. This is the Overland Stage line, and this probably is not to premiere. And for those of you that are looking at this on a slide or in the Zoom, you might not be able to follow it. But if you follow this up, it goes up over South Pass and comes back down towards Fort Bridger, and then goes down here to Salt Lake Valley, and then west to Sacramento. So this is the main route through South Pass, but ultimately that changed. They changed and they moved the Overland one down through Denver, then up across to Fort Bridger. But here is a place called South Bend, or called Granger and Fort Bridger. Those things are consistent through time. So those two stage stations are there for a long period of time. In fact, you can still go and visit that particular place. In Wyoming, it's one of the longest continuously occupied spots in the state. So it was started in 1843, and there's been a building and people living there since 1843. The stage station was just set right there because it had good water and good grass. Next slide, please. Our archaeological excavations centered around the Overland Stage Stations and feeder stage lines in western Wyoming. The stage station range in date from 1858 to 1906. Stage stations didn't go out of phase or out of fad even after the cars came, because basically some stage stations, like at Fort Bridger, became hotels and they became the restaurants. So restaurateurs just set up at the same place because the cars followed the same trails and they ultimately paved them. You know, the story was it was a First Nation trail, then it became a path, it became a trail where the stage stations went across, then it became a highway. It's just a natural corridor that you go through. So a feeder station is a little bit different. What happens is once you get the railroad through, the need for stage service diminishes. not the need for freighting services, and I'll come back to that in a second. The feeder lines start at the railroad and go north to a mining town, south to a mining town, and they set up stage station at intervals that are not necessarily the 17 to 20 miles that I just gave you apart. They're actually, some of them are further apart than what they were along the Overland Trail or along the Butterfield Trail. So we did excavations along the main trail and along feeder trails, and it's kind of really interesting to compare the differences between the two. To come back to this thing about 1906 and the cars, just a little bit to go back to this. When they started putting in the cars and they started bringing cars in, cars would break down constantly. It took them a long time to get a mechanic-free car. Blacksmiths became the mechanics because basically blacksmiths were the repair shops of the 18th century. So it was a natural progression that these things came to be. This came to be. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the Overland Trail that we're going to look at right now, and I'm going to talk about two different places. And one of them is up here on the Green River, right here. And one of them will be, Platte River, Platte River. One will be on the Green River and then back to Port Bridger. Next slide, please. The Deseret News had an advertisement for the Overland Stage, and you can see daily line and coaches. And the Overland Stage for the Rocky Mountain News had one too that was different. I'm sorry that it's white like this, and so you can't see the Denver, but the Rocky Mountain News advertised for the stage. And we'll see in a minute that when Mark Twain came west, he paid $150 for his trip. It was fairly lucrative to ride inside for the stage companies. They've made money until the railroad came in, and that's the next thing I was going to say. Once the railroad came in, I told you I'd get back to it. When the railroad came in, you didn't have the stage stations because technically it was almost cheaper to ride in a train than it was to go by stagecoach. But if you were moving and you were taking goods, the cost of freight inside the train cost a lot. So along these trails, and I'll show you this just in a moment, they didn't stop using the trails once the railroad came in. They stopped using the stagecoaches. So the trails were used all the way up to 1906, and then they were converted to be automobile roads. Next slide, please. Both the Butterfield and the Overland lines built home and swing stations, which I just mentioned. Next slide, please. Mark Twain traveled over South Pass before the stage line was south road. I'm sorry, that's a typo. From St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California by stagecoach was nearly 1,900 miles, and the trip was often made in 15 days. The railroad cars do it in 4.5 now. Now, he's writing this a little bit later. He writes this in about 1870. So it's after the railroad is there. He publishes a book called Roughing It. Okay. In 4.5 days now, but the time specified in the mail contracts required by the schedule was 18 to 19 days. To get the U.S. federal mail contract to be able to take mail by the stagecoach, you had to do it between 18 and 19 days. If you couldn't consistently do this, then you're in trouble. Now, he says something right here. If I remember rightly, this was to make fair allowance for winter storms and snows and other unavoidable detentions or delays. So what he's saying in his particular thing is that they allowed for those delays because sometimes you get snowed in. Last week, you couldn't have done that across Wyoming in a car. You couldn't have done that in a snowcat because he just shut it down, you know. Next slide, please. When the Overland Stage moved south in 1862, it followed an immigrant route over the Laramie Plains and through Bitter Creek Valley. So basically, they let the military find where these routes were. People like Jim Bridger actually pioneered the Overland Trail where the Overland went through. Then later on, immigrants going to California took their wagons across it. And then the stagecoach came. So first pioneers, the trappers, as you know, then the stagecoaches, then, freight, and then immigrants, and then the stagecoach. So this is basically through the south part of the state. And you see how this is pretty desolate. You don't see many trees. We removed the trees so you could study our rocks. So we were very generous people in Wyoming that way. Next slide, please.
The same thing happened here in Cage.
Same thing. Yeah, you're generous here too. Yeah, this right here is actually ruts. Now, I've got to be careful not to stop and digress because I'll get carried away here. But in Mongolia, they do not have a lot of paved highways. Where we have to work, it's 250 miles on a 2-track road. They spread out. So it gets muddy or their animals overgraze a place and they move to the side Where you've got a constriction like this, you'll find trail ruts go right through these particular locations. So the trail ruts from where the stage station went are still there. And Wyoming does not have enough moisture that it washes away the ruts. So you can actually see the ruts from the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s. So right up to, they're still there in excellent shape. Next slide, please.
Where is this?
This right here, this right here is just to the east of the Platte River, just to the east of the Platte River. This right here is those trail ruts I was talking about. This is Sulphur Springs, which in reference to the Platte River would be to the west of the Platte River. But these are the ruts that I'm talking about. These ruts are getting driven on. This swell right here is a historical swell from the times gone past. So you actually can see where the swell was or where they passed, where the stagecoaches and where the freight wagons went through. Next slide, please. In addition to this, people would carve their names, and I'll show you this in a moment, but they would carve their names as they went along, and especially along the Overland Trail, every little bit that you've got a rock face that people carve their names. And once they stop and hit, it's almost like a little bit of graffiti. They do it everywhere. This is on that solitary rock that you saw just now near Sulphur Springs, and this is carved on that solitary rock that's isolated. They had to go right by it. They saw somebody else wrote their name, so they put their name there too. Next slide, please. What's really interesting is about when John came through here. Next slide, please. He came through here in 1859. So he came before the stage line came through here, and the stage line wouldn't come through this particular location for another 3 years. It moved from up north down south. So initially it was up over South Pass, then it moved down through Bitter Creek and over what they call Bridger Pass. So in 59, he was taking this trail before the fact that it was a major stage station, major stage line. Next slide, please. At the home stations, like at the Platte River crossing, you could get meals. Next slide, please. Mark Twain paid $150 in 1861 for a stage trip from St. Joseph, Missouri to Carson City, Nevada. He didn't even make it to Sacramento, and that's what it cost him was $150. Now, that's a considerable amount. You guys, if you read about Mark Twain, if you're a Mark Twain devotee, if I make a mistake on this, you correct me, but I love Mark Twain and I love Roughing It. I'll give you another quote from it in just a moment. But he would talk about how rough it was riding and stuff like this. And he's kind of a character. The Civil War broke out, and his brother, I believe it was, worked in Lincoln's administration. He joined the Confederacy and he says, well, this isn't for me. And he switched sides and they said, well, this isn't for me. I just don't like the war. So he asked his brother to get him a position in Nevada because Nevada had the big silver mines. So that's why he went west. He's not a draft dodger. He did join. He did just join the wrong side and switch to the right side, depending on your view of things. But it's kind of a funny story. Next slide, please.
So Debbie, did he pay more because he was the only one in the?
No, actually it was a full coach. So the coach had 6 to 8 people, and he'll talk in a minute. I took a quote from that, but it was yeah. So it was pretty profitable. Mark Twain traveled in the northern route and wrote, at the Green River Station, we had breakfast, hot biscuits, fresh antelope steaks, and coffee. The only decent meal we tasted between the United States and the Great Salt Lake City. At 5 p.m., we reached Fort Bridger, 117 miles from the South Pass and 1,025 miles from St. Joseph. Sorry that it clipped on this. Next slide, please. I have to remember this. Like at Green River, the North Platte was crossed on a ferry. So this is deadly. When they got to the rivers, the people that were going west, if you played the game Oregon Trail or know anything about it, when people are going west, they knew they were going to have to cross this great desert. Everybody says you've got to take enough water with you. When you get to water, you got to get enough water. They got to the Platte River and they got to the Green River, and they are cold, deep rivers, especially the time that they got there. And I think that somebody told me in one statistic, now I'm going to give you a statistic and I'm not making it up here. Somebody gave it to me. It's not, his name is Joshua Camp, and he's the curator at Fort Bridger Historical Site. He said that only 5% of the people in the United States at this time could swim. And when you think about it, they didn't have swim pools. They could go take the lessons. They could maybe swim in creeks, but most people didn't swim. And they heard about the desert and they got to the rivers, and they either had to get a ferry and lash their boats together or floated across to get through there. And they get into the place like the Green River or the North Platte, and it's cold and it's swift, and hypothermia sets in. More people died of drowning than of gunshots or accidental gunshot shootings in going west. That was one of the highest casualties was from drownings. So there were a lot of drownings that took place. So these people built ferries. Now, Denver had convinced the person that owned Holiday, that it owned the Overland Stage Station, to build this route because they wanted to come down through Denver. Gold had been discovered in Denver, then come up to Salt Lake. They said it'd be more profitable for you. It was true, and the guy figured it out. But the people in Denver said, if you do this, we'll build a bridge across the North Platte. Well, that was a good story. It never happened. So they had to ferry it across when they got to the North Platte. Well, at the Green River and the North Platte, except for if you're a stage company, you were delayed. If you're an immigrant, you had to wait for a ferry to be there. You had to wait to pay the right price, and you were stuck. Next slide, please. And you filled up your time however you could. Yeah. This right here is a raft. This is from Library of Congress, and I was told this. And the reason is because you don't get good rafts with people taking stagecoach across. If you know anything about stagecoaches, you know that this is an older stagecoach. So this painting is actually from 1830, but it does show the concept of taking it across. They use this one here, they use it for a drift. The better ones are cables. The cables from the ferries on the Green River are still there because they don't rust away. So you can actually go and see the cables where they had the cables that they used to pull across on the Green River. Next slide, please. This is basically the route in Western Wyoming College, and I'm going to show you this right here. This is Pass Creek, North Platte. It's right here on the North Platte, and they had to stop and delay. Then there's Pine Grove, and then Sulphur Springs, there's Bridger Pass, and Washington on over here. I'm going to skip all the way over here to Hams Fork, and then go back over here to Fort Bridger. So the ones that we're going to look at the stage station, Fort Bridger in more detail, and we're going to look at one up north of here, and I'll show you that map in just a moment. Next slide, please. I am going to talk about the crossing. Now, at the North Platte, I told you they were delayed, so they carved names. These are more difficult to read. We had a project where we had it was contracted to do, where we had to go and write down people's names on one of these trail inscription places. This is grease. And the grease was more organic. So they would take and they would put right with axle grease. They'd have to change the axle grease out of their axles. And they had time to do repair on their wagons and stuff like that because they're waiting to go across on the ferries. They would write with axle grease. The interesting thing about it is because it has organics in it, it's not like some of the petroleum products we have right now. Lichens will grow in it. And so it'll get an outgrowth. So it sometimes stand out. In this case, however, unfortunately, you can't probably make it out. You can make out this one, but this is a later one. Next slide, please. I'll show you. But it's intriguing to me. Also, people died crossing here. This person died in the crossing in 1861. I've got to be cautious. I can't find him in the journal. I got to be cautious of saying what the cause of death is. I can't attribute it to drowning. I can't attribute it to cholera. I don't know. But the person died in 1861, and this is his grave. This is 1877. That just shows that they were reused. Some of the better trail diaries for southern Wyoming exist after the completion of the railroad. Latter-day Saints were coming in, and they were bringing a lot of people into the Salt Lake Valley. And what the church would do is pay for them to go to the trains where the train ended and then load them up on freight wagons or take the wagons on to Salt Lake City. So that was one thing that they did. But afterwards, most of the trail immigrants who were going across were going to settle in Oregon and Washington still after the railroad was completed. But like I said earlier, they had to take all their family goods and everything with them. It was too expensive to freight it in the train. Next slide, please. This is 1870. Now, this is kind of like what archaeologists do in the very visual things. That's a name, that's a date, we got it down. But sometimes people lie, like I would tell you what my age is, but then not really. But we do know that this crossing is right. The July 13th date is the day you want to be here. You want to leave St. Joseph in time to get to South Pass by July. Independence Rock, people reached Independence Rock in the northern on the North Platte and on the Sweetwater River about the 4th of July. If you did that, then you wouldn't get caught like the Donner's Party did. You had to make sure that you knew what you were doing. You're coming across. And the immigrant season was set out very meticulously after time. But that was through learning and through mistakes like what the Donner Party had, where they got caught in the snows and the Sierras. Next slide, please. Come on.
I'm trying, but I can't see
sorry.
it. You're good.
This is the Platte River right here. Notice there's not very many trees along it. It's just basically because of the fact the soils are too alkaline and too rocky. A lot of places where you don't see a lot of plant life and you know that you've got a pretty good habitat around there, it's because the soils aren't good for the large trees. Next slide, please. Here again is another one, and this is again, I like this one because it's real obvious that it's axle grease. And then you can see the ones underneath it. This is just graffiti right here. I don't like to give them their due. Next slide, please.
You didn't consider that graffiti though.
Yeah, the one on top
Does
is
it have to be to not be graffiti?
50 years.
Okay.
So horses were changed at swing stations. Next slide. And this is a big pond in this swing station. They were changed at the swing station. Next slide. And he described them. Sorry, this might not.
No, I need to get rid of this. Hang on one second.
Okay.
Let me
Get rid of that.
Let me act like I read that and then
Okay.
it'll go away.
Whenever the stage stopped to change horses, now at the swing station, like at Big Pond right there, whenever, this is Mark Twain writing again. Whenever the stage stopped to change horses, we would wake up and try to recollect where we were and succeeded. And in a minute or two, the stage would be off again, and we likewise. We began to get into country now threaded here and there with little streams. These had high, steep banks on each side, and every time we flew down one bank and scrambled up the other, our party inside got mixed somewhat. They're talking about arroyos. So they're going down into arroyos and coming back. So they're not quite streams, but you know how it is. First, we would all be down in a pile at the forward end of the early in a sitting posture, and in a second, we would shoot to the other end and stand on our heads. And we would sprawl and kick to and ward off ends and corners of mailbags that came lumbering over us and about on us. And as the dust rose from the tumult, we would all sneeze in chorus. The majority of us elbowed one another. That's cut off on us. We elbowed one another. So I love the way Mark Twain just describes these things, but Mark Twain does a good job in describing it. Yeah, it's just amazing. You just like liquid, Next. So this is Big Pond right here. Next slide, please. Okay. Fort Bridger was a home station. Now, Fort Bridger was not like this in 1857 due to the Utah War. The entire fortification was burned down there, and then it was rebuilt in 57 and 58. In fact, the first blacksmith shop built by the military was put there in 57. It was put adjacent to this stage station right here. The stage station you see was constructed here was constructed by William A. Carter. He arrived at Fort Bridger in November of 1857. By 1860, in present dollars, because it was in the census, he was worth $50,000, which is $1.2 million in today's value. He made that by selling goods to people traveling through, by selling goods as a sutler to the military, by selling horses to people that had worn out horses, and by selling cattle, and through other things that he did. He also traded goods here, and he also sold dinners. Now, I don't know if in one of those that I showed you from Mark Twain was there, but I read in two different places that the meals cost $1, $1.50. And he said that the best meal he had was at Green River, but some people complained that all they had was deer and flour on the deer and maybe a potato. But there wasn't a real good meal, and it cost $1, $1.50. And that's a lot of money considering everything else. But this right here is the front part of the Sutler's Trading Post right here, the Sutler's place, and also where people came in to trade goods when they were stopped at the home station. This is kind of important, actually. Next slide, please. As a home station, Fort Bridger had a blacksmith shop, a telegraph after 1860, provided food, and had a variety of trade goods such as blankets and clothing for sale. The 1850 census has more Native Americans than it does have any other group of people, and the 1860 does too. What they did was they were traders. They would trade blankets, so they would take and tan the hides and sell the blankets for, sell the hide blankets, and they'd sell clothes. So at this trading post, you could get a wide variety of things, but the home stations might have those kind of things for sale. So you could do more than just buy a meal in a lot of places. Next slide. The telegraph line came through in 1860, came across through here and enters the building. And I'll show you in a moment where it enters the building. But you could actually send a telegram, and I have no idea what that's cost, but I'm sure it was pretty expensive, from Fort Bridger after 1860. So from 1860 on, you could send a telegraph to anywhere in the United States from Fort Bridger or from the Stagecoach station. Next slide, please. This is where it enters in the building. On October 24th, 1861, I'm sorry, I lied to you a minute ago. So wipe that out. It's not 60, it's 61. 61, the first transcontinental telegraph system was completed by Western Union. Now, where this comes in, they actually have a copper, it's a solid copper piece. That wire is actually telegraph wire. One of the things that we find most in archaeological records is telegraph wire because they just roll it up and throw it a hole. And it's real stiff. It's not insulated, which that causes a lot of loss of electricity and they eventually learn how to insulate it. But these were not insulated wires. They were solid copper wire and pretty thick. You know you have as an archaeologist, you know you have an old telegraph wire when you get that thick copper material and it looks like it's never had insulation on it. So it runs right here to the solid mass, then inside to the telegraph keyboard, the telegraph, I can't remember what it is, but Morse code station inside. Next slide, please.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, have you seen line that would be like copper on the outside and a steel core to make it stronger?
Yeah, that would be later.
That was later.
Yeah, so this is pretty much solid copper, pretty much. We excavated at Fort Bridger Stage Station location to gain a better understanding of life at a home stage station that had access to a variety of food resources. Fort Bridger had a large variety of food resources because Latter-day Saints actually operated farms to the south of there. Next slide, please. And Overland, Horace Greeley wrote in his journey, Mormons have at this season put under cultivation with flattering prospects, oats, barley, potatoes, peas, etc. And our crops sought at the enterprise and the enterprising growers have contracts for the supply of Fort Bridger. We're going to leave that off, and the military. So they would supply this stage station with foods. Now, next slide. Next slide, please. The one thing that they didn't have was fresh food. So what we excavated was the well. Wells and outhouses are the best two things to excavate. Given the choice, dig a well. Don't dig an outhouse. We have done both, and I will tell you, you can know what I was going to say, but we'll just leave it. Okay. So at the bottom of the well, we have to pump the water out, but they have everything that they throw in there and you lose things. Next slide, please. Intriguingly, what we found is that pre-railroad, there were no peaches. There were canned peaches, but no peaches. Post-railroad, there were fresh peaches because you get the peach pits and you get cherry pits and all kinds of things. So after the railroad, this station had all kinds of good food at this particular location. Next slide, please. This is what it looks like inside of this, and I'm talk about this in a moment, but it gets rust around here. So they threw a lot of metal inside of here, but the metal basically dissolved inside of this. We had some metal items, but the metal pretty much dissolved, not quite. Next slide, please. This is the construction of it. You can see how well it was made, and it goes down to the water level, below the water level, and we were able to get all the way to the bottom of it. Next slide, please. Okay, we found this buckle, and this buckle could be off pants, or it could be off of a harness, or it could be off a saddle. We can't say specifically what this came off, but we got this belt buckle. Next slide. We got beads. This bead is really pretty small. In the trading post that Jim Bridger had, and the trading post that the Latter-day Saints had, the beads are even smaller. They're extremely small, and I don't even know how they could sew with them, but we have beautiful, really small beads. Next slide, please. This is the back of a turkey, and that kind of intrigues me. I can't tell if it's a wild turkey or we had one of them that was a duck, and so you got to be careful on this, but we can't tell if this was a wild turkey or domesticated turkey that they had, but they threw the bone inside it, and that kind of intrigues me too. This right here is a hair tie, and it's silver. So it was for the back of the hair. So we found the hair tie in this particular place, and they just, you know, you can imagine they bent over to get a cup of water or something like that, and they lost it. And this was actually
in the well.
In the well, and this is actually a zipper. Now that zipper is a 1878. That zippers are a little bit old, but on the back side of it, we could flip it over, and it's got the patent date on it, so we know exactly what date that particular zipper is. Next slide, please. So we got the beads. Ornaments. I might have another photograph of the red bead. The beads and the fasteners for close inside of the well. Next slide, please. That's the red bead that I was telling you about. That actually has the cloth in it. If you are ever excavating and you find a bead that has any age to it, if it's got the center inside of it and it's cotton, it's not an old bead. Cotton is organic and cotton rots. If it's silk, it stays forever. So the silk will last forever even in water. They have a steamship that sunk off outside of Kansas City. And when it went down, all the clothes that had stitching with silk, the stitching stayed together and the garments were in excellent condition. If it was cotton, it had a tendency to rot. And I'll talk about that in just one moment. Next slide. We found cut bones. I can't tell what this is. This is off of a cow, but we found cut bones and butchered bones. So they throw in butchered bones in there. That we can't understand, except they had a butcher shop and they would sell cut meat, fresh cuts of meat there at the Carter's Complex, W. Carter's Complex later on. Next slide, please.
And they would drink water out of this one?
I think it's me too. So, yeah, so if we look at it from another standpoint, the way it basically became a trash pit, and I'll explain that in a minute. But these are older. I don't know.
That sounds awful.
Yeah, I wouldn't have done it. We found this boot. Now, I'm going to give you some methodological things. When you find a boot like this or something like this, it's all leather, you can actually restore it. You put it in the freezer. So we pulled it out, wrapped it in aluminum foil, and immediately put it in the freezer. And then we have time to get the money to repair it. We found a holster and we did the same thing with it. So if you get something that's leather and that's been soaked in water, freeze it, and then you can restore it. And they've got some from the Arabia. That's the name of the steamship that went down outside of Kansas City. They took and they froze it, and you can actually wear those shoes if you want to. That's how good a shape they're in. But we found both sides of the shoe. I just think I had one in the whale. Yeah, good question. So there you go, right there. So you don't want to drink this water. This is where I think it became a trash pit. Next slide, please.
So who was in that boot, though?
I don't know.
Are they in the bottom of the?
All right.
There's a cannon that they found in Cheyenne. It's just a big old cannon, a whole cannon that they had thrown down into a pit. And I asked if it was a well or an outhouse, but they just literally took them through the whole cannon here. I have no idea why people do this, you know. This wood was in here. Now, this wood is kind of important. This wood was inside of it. This is after they decided they're going to seal the well off and not use it anymore. So this is whipsaw. And you know the difference between it's a slow saw method. You still have a wheel that runs real slow and it leaves the whips in there. When you take wood out of water, you can't let it dry. You have to get it out at this point and saturate it in water. What's really intriguing is because wood is porous, the water flows in and occupies between all the cells within inside the wood, especially if it's been soaked for a long period of time. And if you dry it, it shrinks and it loses its form. There's an example of this at the Arabia where the curators have this rolling pin. Now they found whole rolling pins where they have to take and saturate it and replace that water in it. So they have a solution that they put in that replaces it. They have one where they shows where they put the solution in and it looks like a rolling pin that you and I could go to Walmart and buy right now. The other one they didn't do this to, and it completely flattens out because once that water dries out of there, it loses shape. But this was stuffed in there, I think, in the well closure. That's in the upper part of the well. It's not down in the bottom part where we're finding these other things. Next slide, please. Okay, so we finished this and we had excavated another site. So we did the comparative material on this. And so I'm going to show you a more remote, she's going to, I have to wait for her for just 1 minute. So when we finished this right here, we didn't do it at the same time we did this actually earlier. We went to a place called Black Rock and we excavated a stage station. Next slide, please. We excavated a place that's out in the middle of the desert. These are wild horses here. And those wild horses here are old ones. They're barbs. So genetically, they're tied to the old Spanish herds. So genetically, this herd here in the Red Desert and the herd up in southern Montana is the only two that we have that we've got the real old ones. They're not released by ranchers or by miners or anything like this. These are the old horses. This has not got good water, but the only water in this area is where these horses are at, and it's called Radar Springs. And right beside that, they built a stage station. Next slide, please. So this one, if you come down here and you come to Point of Rocks, come north, this is where the site location is for where we excavated, right in this area right here along this straight line. They had to go up over sand dunes. And because of the fact that they had to pull the wagons through sand dunes to get up to South Pass where the mine was, they had to change horses out. So they built this stage station so they could have a place to change them out. Next slide, please.
You're good on time. We started late.
Okay. This right here is pretty interesting. And this is my son. He was really young when he was digging this. He's 43 right now. This structure burned. It burned and the whole thing came down. So it's got stone walls all the way around it, but it burned down. And what they did was pretty interesting. That soil that you saw where it was white right there, they took it and they filled it on top of it and just leveled it out. And then they lived about this far above the burn. Now, to me, it makes a lot of sense to pull this stuff out and not seal it with another soil level there. We found all kinds of things in here. We found burlap sacks with wheat still in it. The wheat had been charred because of the fire. But something happened and the whole structure burned down, but the walls were still in good shape. So that's the other advantage of having stone walls, is you still have competency in the wall if you lose your roof. When they covered it, what some of my friends and some of my associates have told me is when they covered it, they sealed it, it kept insects from coming in. Because now the insects won't bore up from the ground, or they don't want to live in there because that carbon smell, like smell from that smoke, they won't live there. So it creates a little bit of a disease-free area inside of it. And of course, for archaeologists, it's a boom because it seals all the material beneath it. And so you've got excellent material below it. Next slide, please. Here he is doing his job meticulously. Next slide, please. Okay, so when you look at this right here, that top area is where the wall fall is, where the wall is collapsed. This layer right here is that burn. And look how they flattened it out. And then the beams that you see right there, it was a different area than what he was excavating at. But they pretty well leveled it off and made it so that on top of A, see, this is A is the infill from where they infilled it. They had a flat floor that they lived on. So you can see it in that profile. Next slide, please. This is Black Rock. This is the desert that they have to cross across. The stage station sits down here by this alkali lake so that they have water. I don't understand how they could drink that water. Next slide, please. We found, of course, cartridges inside of here. This is very common to find cartridges. We found cartridges. Next slide. Different sizes. Some were 22, some were 32s. Next slide, please. We found galluses, or the stays that are on your side of your pants like this. That's what this is right here. We found galluses. Next slide. We found nails. Now I'm showing you these because there's cut nails, which these are on this side right here, manufactured by a machine. They're not wire nails. So we know that this was made before 1890 because once they got wire nails in, they just switched to them. They would use cut nails somewhat, but that nail right there is a cut nail where they put it on sheets and they cut it off in a sheet in manufacturing. This right here is probably also a cut nail, but it's probably off of a horseshoe. Probably not off of a full. It's probably not off a full nail. This is a wrought nail, which they took a piece of metal and they hammered it on an anvil until they got it in the right shape, is what they wanted. Next slide, please. That's again that same cartridge you saw. This is intriguing to me. Now, this is a silver necklace, but what happens is that in these places like this, let's say that you break your necklace or something like that, you don't throw it away, you modify it, and they modified it and tied these ribbons here. This is actually linking this together. So they didn't want to throw it away. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. The one thing that we found at these stage stations is repair in what we would call vernacular tools. So, for example, if you needed a rake, you didn't go to Walmart and buy a rake, you made a rake. If you needed a sleigh, which I'll show you in a minute, you made that sleigh. Next slide. The one thing excavating at remote stage station reminds you of is you have to make a lot of your own tools and build and repair your own structures. These were constructed, that house that I showed you right there was constructed out of local material. The problem of it is you saw how much desert was there, that Black Rock was, there's no trees. You had to go to the hill beside it and you had to haul aspen in to make the trees. So you had to go up to the woods, cut them down, drag them to the place to make your roof. Then you covered your roof with soil. This is the Targovete Valley in Mongolia, and I'm using this as a comparison because we worked on this project for 12 years. Next slide. And since 2011, the Targovete project in Mongolia has reminded us of what stage station operators knew. You cannot go to stores to get things, which I repeatedly said. You have to butcher your own animals and repair your own tools. Next slide, please. Now, I could show you really grotesque pictures of butchering, but I'm not. In that well, you saw the remnants of what happens to butcher parts. You know, you just make these cuts, but you have to butcher your own animals. And butchering in this kind of environment is a daily or weekly thing because you have no way to refrigerate it. So because of that, the best thing to do is have fresh meat. And Bridger had, I think, 300 cattle in 53, I think it's 300. I'm pretty sure. That's from memory. I have this written down, so I'm not just making it up. But they would butcher these animals and they go. When you butcher the animal, the process begins. You have to real quickly decide what you're going to do. That particular animal, I shouldn't go into this, but I'm going to. When you pull the entrails out, there's a division of labor. You pull the entrails out, you clean the entrails out, you stuff it full of a concoction that's herbal. You take and put in flour, you put in herbs, and you stick it back up, and you immediately make the sausage. From the time that they kill this animal to getting the cape off, to getting it prepared, to having the sausage and the guts prepared is 34 minutes. I've timed it. You get so good and efficient at it, but you have to be able to do this consistently. You can't live in these remote stage stations without it. The interesting thing about that last one that I showed you is that in census records and the other records that I can find, he had a good sheep herd out there. So he lived primarily on sheep. Sheep are a little bit easier than cattle to run because cattle they're just easier to run. So a lot of these guys would have sheep, not Bridger. Bridger, from what I can tell, only had cows. Next slide, please. Sorry. These are rakes that were made. This is the same rake. These are rakes that were made because of the fact that they couldn't buy them. Now, I really get kind of interested in. They had a welded piece right here, and you can see the tongs going here. I don't know if they did it on purpose, but they would repair it themselves. That's a handle that they've created. Next slide, please. And for you that grew up on farms and stuff like this is nothing new to you, but it's something that we forget in this day and age, that you've got to make your own tools. These are sleighs, and this is the curve on the sleigh because technically it snows so much, they've got to be able to sleigh things in and out. That becomes a problem in places like Raider Springs. When the snow gets so heavy, you're going to get drifts, but you're going to have to sleigh things through there. So if you haven't made the sleigh, you've got to make the sleigh to be able to do it, and then you're going to have to repair it. Next slide, please. This is actually a harness in like a travois, but it's not a travois. This has got wheels on them in most cases. This has not got the wheel on this, but it's got an axle. And if you look at this, they use the fork of a tree to make it. Now, we've excavated a site that I talked about 2 years ago, where when the construction, they would always use forks of the trees for supporting. So they use the fork as actually used it naturally. Okay, next slide, please. You have to build your own houses. Next slide, please. And by now they got saws, so they actually have power saws. It's kind of funny, actually, to me. Next slide, please. But they're pretty good at using the same skills that they used to have. Now that roof up there is covered with birch bark and then covered with grass. So the birch bark actually serves as insulation. You use things that are organic, use things that are nearby. Whatever it is that's nearby, you don't go very far to get the items, you get what's available. Next slide, please. Okay, in our archaeological excavations, we found chains, horseshoes, and wrought nails made at the stage stations. So what we've done, and I'm actually going to leave it with this is the last slide. What we've done is we've learned that people adapted pretty well to their environment. In the case of Fort Bridger, when this fort was seized in 1853, Bridger had 1 ton of metal. When they came west with the wagons and the wagon wheel fell apart and they dismantled the wagon, they sold the wagon off or reused the wagon wood for whatever they wanted to do, the metal became something that they could use for other things. What was smart money was to take and cut the metal wheel into sections and trade it to Native Americans and let them use it to make their metal knives and use it to make their metal arrowheads. They would do that with barrel hoops too. So you would cut it into pieces. At trading stations like at Fort Bridger, the principal thing that you would give was a piece of sheet metal, like off a barrel hoop, trade that to a First Nation person, to a Native American that was there. You give them a piece of that barrel hoop, sell them a file and a chisel, and then they could make their own arrowheads. And they got really, really good at it, real quick. Because of the fact that it was a lot better, they could reuse them and they could turn them into nice, get really good at it. Point is that at these sites, they made chains, horseshoes, tools, and wrought nails. And among those tools, they made their own knives. Okay, so I've gone to quite a bit and I've showed you a lot of different places. If you have any, I hope you have questions. Yeah. Yes.
Earlier you mentioned how the cables with the crossing the river,
Yes.
the ferries, they didn't rust. Why didn't they rust?
So dry, and they didn't leave them in the water. Now, what they would do, what I can tell, and it's also what they did as a function of that ferry. So they would run the ferries across during the summer and spring or into early fall. They pull them out of the river. They wouldn't leave that beautiful, because that's really expensive to get that cable. Yeah, so they would grease them. I was drafted. Uncle Sam gave me an opportunity to work in Vietnam on aircraft elevators, and we had cables. And salt water is really damaging on those cables. You just grease them the way you can. Now, I don't know that they had grease, but if you maintain your cable will last forever. Yeah. They are expensive though.
So Conestoga wagons predated the stage.
Yes. Now Conestoga, I had to go look at a bunch of them at Fort Leavenworth. This year I spent more time working on Fort Bridger than I have in my whole life. And I had to go to Fort Leavenworth because the detachment that came to Fort Bridger in 1857 was from Fort Leavenworth. And Leavenworth comes in the 20s or 30s, but by 30s it's there. They had Conestoga wagons that were there. Well, they would freight goods, and this is often overlooked when you play the Overland Trail game. They would freight goods from the Missouri River to Salt Lake City and to Sacramento. There were hundreds and hundreds of freight wagons going through there by the 1850s. In Salt Lake City, in the Deseret News, it talks about how many wagons come into town and what's for sale at these particular stores. They made sure to announce it. But the issue is that those freight wagons came only through a certain period of time. The Conestoga was really, really good. DuPont bought them for sending powder in. So the powder wagons that they had were just a version of the Conestoga wagon. There's different sizes of them. The freight wagons are a little bit bigger. We have a freight wagon at Fort Bridger that's under a shed that was actually used at the time that W.A. Carter was there. The size of those wheels are about between 4 to 5 inches. They're really wide. They're big. They're really durable. They're really durable. So the freight wagon varies in size. It depends on your ability to have a 16 or an 18 wagon pulling through there. In 1857, when there was the Utah War and the Latter-day Saints burned the supply train that was owned by Wardell, when they burned that particular wagon train, it was $300,000 loss. And I can only imagine how many men was it bankrupted. But the private contractor didn't get paid until they delivered the material to the Army. You didn't get paid for taking it from Leavenworth. You paid upon delivery, what I can tell. Now, they might have had a different quartermaster that did it a different system, but not in 1857 with that particular shipment that was coming west of Fort Bridger. When it was burned, it was the contractor that lost, not the Army. Yeah. That's more than you asked for, but.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
So if I remember correctly, part of the Butterfield stage went through went through Fort Bowie National Historic Site.
Yes, goes right.
Okay, so
that's the best place to go and look at ruts and other things too.
Yeah.
The other thing is because the military used it so many times, it had an ability to set it in place. Yes, it came exactly through Fort Bowie, and it's worth your time to go.
It's a neat little park.
Yeah, it's a neat little park, and have you seen that stage station? That stage station?
That's on that trail.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I like about that park is you have to go for a 1.25 mile walk to go to the business.
Right. There's a Black Rock site in southern Arizona. I think that's a state park. It's at least set aside. It's got a lot of rock art. And if you go on the south side of that, it's got one of the Butterfield Stage Stations that was reused for a homesteading place. A lot of those places, that's what happened. The one that I showed you that was dismantled, there's another stage station to the west of that that's called Doug Springs. Yeah, Salt Wells. It's Salt Wells. The local ranchers dismantled it, used it to build their houses with. So some of those things were dismantled because of the fact that they were already cut stones and they had the advantage of loading it up in their buckboard and building where they wanted to.
Did you talk to Dudley about his stage station?
What?
Did you talk to him about your stage station?
Oh, I don't know. I told a story to my wife on the way over here about when I was in Boy Scouts, probably in 1968. There was a member that got the Boy Scout National Historic Trail Award for putting some type of interpretive sign up on the Butterfield stage down somewhere in southern Arizona. We made a camping trip out of it.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
And I remember it was just in the Sonoran Desert and went through it. But I don't remember any home station or swing station there.
Mhm.
It was just along the trail.
So, well, what happens is that there's a lot of them in Wyoming. We got a problem because some were made out of wood and some of them were burned, and you lose them over time. Where ours has got good preservation is like the same thing as Arizona and southern New Mexico. That's where they were made out of stone, because that was the
Right.
best material that they had locally available. The adobe ones melt away if they lose the roof. And the adobe is great, but you got to maintain it. Yeah.
Have they mapped all of the home stations and swing stations out on the Butterfield line?
Probably, if there has been any federal action there, they've done it. So there'd be skips. For example, if there was been no activity or no development in the area, they might not have had the opportunity to map it because they don't have the resources to do it. It's a little bit costly to do, the excavations are costly, and so they don't get it done. Why we could do it is because it was part of education and part of what we did, is why we were able to do this. Because at Fort Bridger, I've been the archaeologist since I was really young when this happened, since 1983. So I've been there 40 years. So because of that, I have this continuity of being able to look at it so we can get a lot of work done. What you've got a problem with on the Butterfield is you don't have that continuity of being able to go back and forth to it. You get people rolling through and they don't get all recorded. I guess where I'm headed with that is you don't have that opportunity to have that continuity.
Would the stages cross paths with each other going
Yes.
back?
Yes, yeah.
How often would there be like one leaving from an origin point in Missouri to go?
The one that I'm familiar with today is the one from Salt Lake left every morning at 8 o'clock. So the
Oh.
eastward bound was every morning at 8 o'clock.
Every day.
Every day. So that was in the 1860s. So, and that was when you had high travel. Some of the highest traffic by stage travel was during the Civil War. If you didn't want to fight in the Civil War, one of the things that was seen as honorable is to go to work in the gold fields, you go to work in the West. Specifically, if you worked in like places like Carson City or Virginia City, where that silver was so needed to reimburse the Treasury of the United States. Some people say that Virginia City funded the Civil War. That's hyperbole, but it was a lot. I mean, it was one of the best silver finds ever made in the world. And it was extremely important. Because of that, they would ship gold. Now, this is where it becomes really interesting, is because sometimes people would steal that gold. And they had this guy that was robbed out past Pointed Rocks out towards Big Pond there. He was robbed in the newspaper. He escaped barefooted. And the newspaper really picked up and says, we don't think this happened. We think it was an inside job because you cannot run across a desert and escape from a posse barefooted. We know that desert.
Yeah.
Meaning you get a lot of cactus spines in your feet,
So
Yeah.
Brian Blue online is asking, have you done any research on stage stations that existed between Flagstaff and the Grand Canyon?
No, I didn't. I haven't. No,
Do you know of any?
there's got to be some. Yeah.
Your next project.
Yeah.
You're looking for a funder.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brian.
We take volunteers at Fort Bridger.
Right.
In July, we're going to reconstruct one of the walls there. So you get up there in July.
Have you read that book by, I think it was Rinker Buck? He wrote about going across the Oregon Trail in 2008, his brother,
Yeah.
Yes.
taking a mule team, 3 mules,
Yeah.
going from
Yeah.
Missouri, Kansas City, I don't know exactly where, but
Right.
they went across the whole way, made it all the way to Oregon.
Yeah. We get a lot of reenactors come through Fort Bridger in the
Yeah.
summertime.
And it's a lot of LDS.
The hand carts,
in
yeah.
Wyoming.
Yeah, the hand,
Like changing names and stuff,
Yeah.
historical sites.
yeah, the hand carts will come through in the centennial, I think it was centennial or 150th, I can't remember what the celebration was. It probably the 125th or something like that. A whole lot of people came through at that particular period of time, and we let them camp at Fort Bridger. You have to get permission to camp because you have to waive the fees that you have to put it ahead of time to do it, but you can do that. You can, if you're doing something like that. It's a process. You just can't go camp there.
No.
Yeah.
When you say they're changing the name of the places,
So
or
they're changing, like Devil Gate is something else that the LDS church changed. This is in the book, I don't know.
Well, some of it's
they're not
changed by,
changing it like First Nation?
yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Some of
No,
it's
they're
changed.
changing it to a lot of LDS history.
But they would have named.
But then what supersedes that is a Native American, if the
Yeah.
native, the TIFO, the Tribal Preservation Officer wants that to go back to what the name
Yeah,
was,
the
then it
original.
goes back to it. Then in, and so like on our signs, I'm on the Arts, Parks and History Commission at the state. On our signs, if we're given the names, we put the names of each person, each tribal name or each group name.
Yeah.
Some places have multiple names, like Devil's Tower.
Yeah.
It's got multiple names depending on if you're Kiowa, Cheyenne, Sioux, Arapaho. So you just need to consider those people's name for that place,